Hello and welcome to Fully Charged. Now, I'm recording this introduction after I've recorded the conversation that you're about to see. So I know that it's really, really interesting. I have been talking to Greg Archer from Transport and Environment, which is a research think tank lobby group. That's how I'm going to describe it. So they are deeply embedded in the whole world of zero carbon transportation, of clean technology, but particularly transport. So cars, obviously, delivery trucks, buses, taxis, all that stuff, but also flights and shipping. And Greg's got some really interesting, I haven't mentioned his name, Greg Archer from Transport and Environment. Greg has got some really interesting information about how we can continue to, or as it is at the moment, go back to living how we did, but with much less impact on the very small planet that we all live on. So here we go, Greg Archer from Transport and Environment. I think the topics that are fascinating me, I'm afraid, because I've been referring to the COVID-19 pandemic as the thing.
The thing.
Just because everyone's talking, and I don't want to talk about it, but in a sense, I would love to get your take, because there's quite a few things on the Transport and Environment website about the impact on, whether people are going to buy electric cars. I mean, clearly they're not at the moment. They're not buying anything,
Not buying anything, no.
No, or and the impact. I think those things are interesting. How much cleaner the air is, how much less, particularly in cities. I mean, but even out here, because we're right out in the sticks, it's really noticeable even here, which I'm surprised at, because there's no dense traffic near us. But I think over the whole country, it's changed.
Did you see the moon last night?
Yes!
This amazing pink moon.
Yeah.
And part of course, that moon is really close to the Earth, but also the air is so much cleaner. The levels of particulates are so much lower that you get a really crisp view of the moon, which we never normally see.
We never do. I mean, is that that's generally accepted the reason then? I mean, the particulate levels are that much lower. I mean, I'm very aware of it as a human being breathing. But is that the case? Because it's got to. The thing is, it's global, isn't it? Because I always remember, because when it is a clear sky here, we can see vapor trails, and we're
right.
Slightly to the north of, I would think, a major highway going over to the United States. So we see lots of planes. We've got very few at the moment. Now, there was a time when there was the volcano in Iceland a few years ago, which restricted air flights in Europe. But it was only in Europe, and so then we'd have this amazing clear sky, not one vapor trail, which is what we're seeing now. But that's over the whole world now. I mean, that is what is fascinating, I think a lot of people are aware of the constant torrent of, fossil fuel burning around the world and how that's changed. I mean, it
makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
I mean, these ultrafine particles, particularly those dispersed in the upper atmosphere by planes, have a big impact upon visibility to the stars. But down on Earth, of course, the air is also a lot cleaner. Massive traffic reductions, but also less industry.
Yeah.
And the combination has had a profound impact on the quality of the air, which hasn't been at these levels, well, probably not since pre-industrial revolution.
Really, it's that much of a change. It is that much of a change,
I would say.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean,
so, in fact, our human lungs, because we grew up in this era, have never experienced air quite like that. Well, I suppose unless you go to the Outer Hebrides or somewhere very remote, maybe you might experience it.
Yeah. If you go to really remote places, then particularly with westerly winds, where it's blown in off the Atlantic, you can get some really clean air. I mean, years ago, I did research on the west coast of Ireland, because that was the place we had the cleanest air.
Right.
But we would try and measure things at very, very low levels.
Yeah.
But now we've got, you know, not just this huge reduction in traffic, but also no planes, much less industry. And so, yeah, the air is as clean as it's been within multiple generations.
Wow. I mean, it is intriguing, because I don't know how. I've been sort of toying with the idea, and it's a dangerous one in terms of social media, going, you know, this is how we should live all the time, and there is technology that enables us to do that, and we just need to adopt it, you know, which is something I firmly believe in. But it feels a bit wrong at the moment, because there's so much other, you know, there's clearly other very urgent priorities that
I mean, we should not be glorifying the fact that we've got wonderfully clean air because nobody can move around. That is not a solution.
No.
It is actually an enormous benefit, because there's some very good research from Harvard University, for example, that shows that even tiny increases in the levels of fine particles in the air has a big impact upon the level of COVID deaths, for example.
Wow.
So, in fact, the fact that the air is so clean at the moment should be helping in terms of the general population and the health of the general population.
Right. So it's not that it wouldn't stop you catching it necessarily, but it would more likely the result would be less serious, hopefully.
The result, according to the Harvard research, is less serious as a result, and we obviously need to think about that in the future, because there's going to be a lot of people at the end of this crisis who've got sort of long-term chronic health problems, respiratory problems as a result of contracting the virus. And they're going to need the air to be cleaner in order to have a good quality of life, because they're going to be very susceptible to the higher levels of pollution, which will inevitably return once normal life returns.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be glad. I'm not glad that the air is clean. You know, I'd much rather people be going about their normal lives today, but it's a benefit in terms of the impact it's having on people today. Yeah. And it's certainly something that we need to try to lock in to the future, but we need technology to do that, and more responsible car use, not stopping moving around, because that's not a solution.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you explain to our viewers and listeners about transport and environment, just to explain where that comes from, what its motivations are, what your... And also, actually, how you got involved. I mean, what your background is, because clearly you have a scientific background, do you, before you were doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a science degree originally. I've done air pollution research and research on CO2 emissions and things like that. I've been working on transport for about 15, 20 years now. Transport and Environment is both a think tank and a campaigning organisation that works on trying to reduce the environmental impacts of transport. It was set up, and its main office is in Brussels, and historically it worked on the European regulations to do with fuels and vehicles, and that's where I worked for 8 years. Trying to design good European rules around CO2 emissions from cars. I did a lot of work on the Dieselgate scandal, exposing the fact that that was industry-wide, but also how we solved that problem by putting in place new tests and new testing procedures. But Transport and Environment is now diversifying. It's now set up a series of offices in countries around Europe, and I'm now working in the UK, trying to get better transport and environmental policies so that we have cleaner air, less CO2 emissions, and of course we get this shift to zero emission vehicles.
Because that, I mean, would you do lobbying? Like, is that one of the roles of Transport and Environment? Would you lobby government ministers and people like that? Absolutely. Right.
I mean, in Brussels, we are essentially the opposition to the car industry and the oil industry.
I imagine they do some lobbying too.
Yeah, they do a fair bit of that, and they've got plenty of resources to be able to get it done. We also, though, if you want to be a good lobbyist, you've got to know what you're talking about. And therefore, we do a lot of research that underpins the studies that we do, and we like to think we're very strongly based on the evidence and the facts. Not just putting forward that, we'd like things to be a bit greener.
Yeah, because that is, I mean, I do want to touch on Dieselgate because it is such a huge issue. And I mean, it is, when I see the pictures, there was a guy in America sent me last year, the photographs of all the Volkswagens in the desert. New, relatively new, perfectly good cars. They all run, and there's there's tens of thousands of them, of fairly new Volkswagens. And I think we're less aware of the impact of it in Europe in a way, because in America, really, they went, no, you can't drive them, and Volkswagen had to buy them back from you. It's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The US required Volkswagen to buy those vehicles back. In Europe, the company has hardly been anything.
Yeah.
Fined very small amounts by the German government, but not Europe-wide. And in the UK here, I mean, we actually approved a lot of the Skoda vehicles. They were approved by the Vehicle Certification Agency. They were responsible for finding Skoda, but it was never done.
Right.
The government simply never proceeded with the actions to fine them for that wrongdoing.
Yeah.
So, and of course, as a result, we've still got millions of dirty cars driving around on our road, producing levels of nitrogen oxides way above the legal limits.
Yeah, which is extraordinary, isn't it? I think it was from Volkswagen's point of view, very unfortunate timing that it was discovered during the previous American administration, who did care about that. Because if they did it now, they could basically be burning coal. They could have coal-powered Volkswagens and they'd be fine. They're great cars, beautiful cars.
I'm not so sure. They're a German company. They're not an American company.
No, that is true. No, but
the Americans have always taken a hard line with foreign companies in terms of meeting their regulations.
Well, because that's the other thing. A couple of engineers I've spoken to who work in the automotive industry, when it's not just VW. I mean, they cited. I'm not going to list them now. A lot of other manufacturers, both here and in the United States and Japan, that make diesels that claim they're this level, and they're when they've been tested properly, they're clearly not.
No, I mean, virtually every company was doing the same thing. Yeah. Perhaps not as blatantly as Volkswagen did.
It was very blatant.
But for example, lots of companies would, like Mercedes, were turning down how effective the exhaust treatment systems were at temperatures below 18 degrees. So these cars are only effectively working well in the summer. In winter, their exhaust treatment systems hardly work at all.
Right.
And all the manufacturers were doing similar things. Some based it upon how hard the car was accelerating. If it accelerated hard, the exhaust treatment system switched off.
Right.
So they were all doing it in different ways. It's just Volkswagen chose a really basic approach and frankly got caught.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, to be fair to them now, what they're doing now, it appears, and this is really another topic I want to talk to you about, but the most recent pictures I've seen of very large car parks full of Volkswagens, they're full of ID3s in Germany, tens of thousands of electric cars they've made, but they can't sell them, particularly at the moment. I guess they're not, even if they've sold them, they're not delivering them to customers at the moment because of the lockdown and everything.
Well, I don't think it's due to the lockdown, Robert. It's down to the fact that they haven't sorted out the software.
Well, there is that.
So, I think what they've done is they've built up this big stock of ID3s that they're waiting to sell. Obviously, they can't do it because of COVID. But before that, they were finalising the software on those vehicles. And of course, they can just upload the new version of the software to the car, and then it's ready to roll.
Yeah.
And this is partly being driven by the European regulations, which they have to meet in terms of the average CO2 emissions from all the cars they sell this year. Right. So they need to be selling those ID3s this year to bring down their CO2 emissions and ensure they don't get fined a considerable amount of money. Volkswagen could be looking at €1 billion in fines.
I think it is incredible, isn't it? I mean, yeah. I mean, that is because that side of it is the what I've been trying to understand in the last sort of year or so is the difference between government encouragement for people to take up electric vehicles and a genuine groundswell, not influenced by anything outside the fact that people prefer that technology once they understand it, and where that lies. Because we're still getting you can still get a grant, can't you? If you buy an electric vehicle in the UK, you still get some money off that. And I mean, all the statistics I've seen of it are that the sales are increasing, or let's just go up till the end of last year. But the sales of electric cars are increasing, and pretty much everything else was particularly diesel, was falling very dramatically.
Well, in the last couple of months, the sales of electric vehicles have really rocketed.
Oh, they have gone up. That's what I didn't know. I wanted to check.
So the last couple of days, the new figures for March showed that there were 7.5% were either battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. I think it was around 5% battery electric.
Right.
So this is, 3 times, nearly 4 times what was being sold last year.
Right.
And the reason for this is because, as I say, the manufacturers now have targets to meet, which came into effect for sales this year. So if they don't sell low emission vehicles, particularly zero emission vehicles, then they can potentially be fined very large sums of money.
Right.
So what happened at the start of this year was they opened the tap. The supply tap was switched on, and alongside that, we've seen much more advertising of electric vehicles and much more attractive packages, finance packages, in the dealerships as they actually try to sell these vehicles for the first time. And I think there's always been a pent-up demand from customers to buy these vehicles. There simply wasn't the choice and the availability and the finance packages that made them attractive in the past. And those things are starting to be put in place, and the sales are really taking off.
Right.
But we still have a market that's being driven by regulation. What we need to happen over the next couple of years is for that demand to keep growing, and the manufacturers to realise that actually they can make a lot of money selling these cars, and then it becomes a really profitable market that takes off as we all expect it to do.
Yeah. And then in terms of commercial vehicles, because that's clearly, I think that in a way, I think that's almost a more important sector. If all the deliveries that we were having were done by electric vans, that's having a pretty big impact, particularly at the moment. I mean, do you see that as becoming a realistic, the last time I was in London, which was a week before the lockdown, I was very aware of the number of electric taxis and delivery vans I was seeing. It did seem like there's definitely more this was in central London. I was walking through central London, but I saw a lot then, but over the whole country. I mean, around here, I've never seen one where I live in the Cotswolds. I've never seen one.
No, I mean, there is more, but I think it's true to say that for vans in particular, that supply tap has not been switched on. Right. And the reason is that the regulations for vans are not as ambitious as the regulations for cars are. Right. So the manufacturers don't need to sell electric vans in order to hit their CO2 targets for the vans they sell. And so they haven't started promoting or selling electric vans because they don't need to. Right. What they want to do is to keep flogging the old asset, the old diesel vans, which they've always done. If we had more aggressive regulations on vans, then the industry would have to start selling more electric vans. That supply tap would be switched on. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. The market would respond really fast, because if you look at the total cost of ownership of owning and operating a van, it's much more cost effective to use an electric van than it is to run a diesel van. Yeah. The problem is there's no choice in the market and there's no availability. Yeah. And that's due to the weak European regulations on vans compared to cars.
But I mean, it is also fascinating, because I've heard, that what you've described many times before. And what it shows us in a very stark way is that the actual manufacturers, don't care. They just want to they've got a plant that produces diesel engines. They can do them really economically. They produce tens of thousands, if not millions of them every year, and they can put them in vans and flog them and going. And what you feel like is all this environmental stuff is like, like an annoying kid. And they go, oh God, we've got to do some electric ones. And that was definitely the case 8-9 years ago. I saw it up front. Now it's a little bit more discreet. They will push, the big manufacturers will push the fact that they're very committed to a green transformation of the transport fleet and all that stuff. But the fact is, I don't know about today, but certainly very recently, there were huge factories producing diesel engines in 2020. You know, the really, I mean, because I've always had a thing about diesel. I've always thought, I don't like the sound. You know, I'm talking pre-electric vehicles 30 years ago. People say, you should get a diesel, it's more economic. I want a petrol car with a V6. I don't want a bloody diesel. It sounded like a bread van. I always thought they were awful. When diesels went into cars, I always thought it was such a, and it was a bad idea. I think we can now acknowledge.
Oh, it was a bad idea. Well, It was a bad idea because the regulations were simply not met.
Yeah.
So we did have plans to have much cleaner diesel cars. The problem is they were only cleaner in laboratories, not on the road.
Yeah.
And therefore, when we got this big increase in diesel, we also got with it a big increase in air pollution because the air pollution rules were not being met when the cars were driven on the road.
Yeah.
But for van manufacturers, this is a particular problem because, the car market back in 2014 was over half of it was diesel. Over half of it in 2015 was diesel.
Right.
The diesel market share is now around 20% in the UK.
So
it's
huge.
collapsed.
Yeah.
So those plants which used to build diesel engines for cars, they need to be selling diesel vans. Otherwise, there's nowhere for those engines to go.
Wow.
So this is part of the problem that they really want to hang on to that diesel van market because otherwise there's nobody buying diesel. And the rest of the world doesn't buy diesel apart from Europe.
Right.
So it's not economical to continue with that diesel technology they've invested in. And people like Mercedes invested billions in developing their new diesel engine. They want to sell some.
Yeah. Yes. To claw back that. I mean, I always thought that, and the very unfair comparisons. This is why I've always shied away from being a sort of obsessive Tesla fanboy because they've got it made. They don't have that legacy. They don't have to talk about it. They don't need board meetings where they go, well, what are we going to do with the plant outside Lübeck that makes diesel engines? They never did it, so they've got a very unfair advantage in that area alone, apart from anything else. I mean, that is because do you think though that in the long run, say in the next 10 years, I mean, well, here's a question: is it going to be are we going to enter a period where producing a battery electric vehicle, let's say Volkswagen, Mercedes, Audi, whoever it is an economic proposition for the manufacturers? They can make them, they can make a profit out of them, and they can carry on making them, and they'll get cheaper because of the economies of scale. They're producing more of them. I mean,
I really think that is entirely realistic, and I don't think that is a long way off. I think within 5 years, give or take, I think the manufacturers will be making more margin selling an electric vehicle, plus all the ancillary services that they sell with that vehicle, compared to selling an ICE vehicle.
Right.
And when they're making more money selling that electric vehicle, then they will want to sell as many electric vehicles as possible, because that will drive their profits.
Yeah.
And so we can then see that suddenly it won't be a gradual transition away from ICEs. It will happen really fast,
right?
Because suddenly the manufacturers will want it to happen fast for their own profitability.
Yes, right.
And yes, there'll be a bit of legacy that they want to work out the system, but they're already doing that today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do sense in the dealings I've had with sort of big automotive companies that it's not a shrug and here's three we've made 3 electric ones to and we'll give one to the mayor, which happened it felt like that was happening for a long time. There was a lot of sort of compliance cars produced, and there's always a photograph of the mayor standing next to it of any town, generally holding the charge cable in the charging socket, which no one ever does. Who holds it? You hold a petrol pump, you never hold it, you plug it in and walk away. The amount of photographers who've asked me to stand there and hold the thing, I've learnt my lesson. I go, no way am I holding it. I'm not even going to look at it. Just take the picture.
I mean, you're dead right. If we look at the period from, say, 2010 to 2018, even 2019, that was what it was. It was a lot of greenwash. It was a lot of, we're going to do this in the future. I think now there is a real change. Now the manufacturers are actually trying to sell small numbers of these vehicles, and they're trying. And if you look at the production plans, most manufacturers aim to be making around 20% of their cars in Europe as being battery electric or plug-in hybrids by 2025.
Right.
So, in other words, they are gearing up to supply a lot more vehicles.
Yeah.
And as soon as they make more money on them, then they'll want to make a lot more.
Yeah.
I would argue that hydrogen is still in that phase of, let's plug the hydrogen car in and show it recharging. It's not really yet a commercial prospect. It's running roughly 10 years behind where battery electric vehicles are.
But then what about hydrogen for commercial vehicles, for big commercial vehicles? That's where, because I went on a hydrogen coach in South Korea, made by Hyundai. Amazing. I mean, amazing, I don't know what, 50-seat, great big, like a tourist coach, that scale. Yeah. And the only stuff that came out the back was water. And you just go, and it was, they clearly had told the driver, we were driving from a coastal town up into where the Winter Olympics were. It was the year of the Winter Olympics. And so it was uphill, up a mountain, and you could clearly tell the driver had been told, overtake every diesel bus you see. So he was hammering it up this thing. But I mean, it shifted. It was really impressive. And it had a 450-mile range. So to do that with a battery on a vehicle that scale, the battery would have to be, I can't even imagine how big, enormous, and so this was and it just made sense that you've got a big vehicle, you can have a big fuel cell that is made of materials that are cheaper than when you try and make a small light one. You've got plenty of room for big tanks for the hydrogen. Yeah. It did have batteries, as all hydrogen vehicles do, which a lot of people who go, hydrogen is the future, don't realize there's quite a large battery pack in a hydrogen car. But it just seems trucks, and it makes so much sense for, because those sort of vehicles like trucks and buses will tend to have a depot and tend to do set routes, which means you can always refill them, you don't have to kind of hunt down filling stations or anything so much.
No, I mean, I think hydrogen has much more promise for commercial vehicles than it does for cars. I mean, I think you also really have to question, though, how the hydrogen is being made.
Yes, where it's from.
This is the big problem, because if you want to make hydrogen for zero-emission vehicles, then that hydrogen's got to be green, and you need a lot of energy to make the hydrogen. It's a very inefficient process. So it's only something like, for every 1 kilojoule of energy you put into for every 5 kilojoules you get put into the system, you'll only get 1 kilojoule of hydrogen out of it in terms of energy. It's about 20% efficient, whereas a battery electric car is probably nearer 90% efficient in terms of the overall system. So you would have to produce enormous quantities of green hydrogen, needing a huge amount of renewable energy to power a big fleet of vehicles. It can be done, but it's a big challenge making all that green hydrogen. So will we actually, remembering a lot of trucks actually on a daily basis only do 70, 100, 150 miles from one place to another and then come back.
Because I've always assumed they're doing...
It's a minority.
Right.
It's a minority that are doing 500 or 1,000 miles across Europe.
Right.
For those vehicles, it's going to be tough to electrify.
Yeah.
But for the type of things doing regional deliveries or urban deliveries, I think electric trucks are entirely feasible.
Right. Oh, that is it, because that's the thing I didn't know. That's the first time I've ever heard that. But now you say it, it immediately makes sense. I assumed all trucks did about 1,000 miles a day, didn't matter what they were doing. But some of them are literally going from a warehouse on the outside of a small town into the supermarket in the middle and then back. It's nothing.
That's right. And they're not doing that many miles. So they could cope with a battery very easily.
Right. The other thing I really want to talk to you about, because that's very much in evidence on your site and on the stories you're covering, is flight, because that is my, when people go, you're on with Greta Thunberg, you're one of those people, and I go, I don't want to do myself down, but really I'm not. I'm over 60 and I have flown so much, particularly in the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 10, being flown by car companies to test drive a car in South Africa. Could have done it in Milton Keynes, to be honest, but amazing amount of flying I've done. I'm also married to an Australian, which means we've lived there. My children lived in Australia for 2-3 years. We went to visit them. So huge, my carbon footprint is double the size of Greenland. It's a major iceberg melting just because of me. And that is an area I'm fascinated in, because I've started to sniff the beginnings of the possibility. I think it's extraordinary. I never would have seen this coming, but of electric flight, of battery electric powered flight. I think it's going to be hyper limited. I don't think I'm going to live long enough to see much of it. But it is interesting that just down the road, we're in touch with Rolls-Royce, who are developing ducted fan wing systems to power airplanes. You just think, that's crazy.
I mean, there is a massive amount that can be done to improve the efficiency of it.
Right.
But we would argue that the battery technology that exists at the moment could only be used in very small planes, for very short flights. Actually, we think there's a better way of electrifying aircraft, and that's by producing something called synthetic fuels.
Right.
So what you effectively do is you take CO2 out of the air, you can capture it from the air, you can combine it in a chemical process with hydrogen that's been made using green electricity just from water, electrolysis, and you effectively create a synthetic kerosene, a liquid fuel, which could be used to power that plane, which is nearly zero emission.
Right.
Now, this is not a new technology. This is actually based on something called Fischer-Tropsch, which has been around for nearly 100 years.
Right.
So it's entirely feasible to do it. The problem is that fuel is expensive. It's about 5 times more expensive than jet kerosene is, was a few years ago, but not even cheaper today.
Yeah.
But if you want to make a fuel that could go into a conventional jet engine, fly you to Australia to see your relatives and get you back again, that technology exists today.
Right.
But the problem is that the fuel is expensive. Yeah. There are no taxes at all on aviation kerosene. They don't pay duty of 57p a litre. Wow. They don't pay a cent of duty. Wow. They also don't pay any VAT on their tickets. We do have air passenger duty, but that's the only tax the airlines pay. So what we would say is, let's put a responsibility on the aircraft industry and on the aviation industry to make them have to buy an increasing amount of these synthetic fuels. We're seeing at the moment the aviation industry with their hand out asking governments for bailouts. Okay, I would say those bailouts are fine, but you haven't been paying your way over the last 50 years. So if you're going to get bailouts now, it comes with a proviso, and that proviso is you have to accept that your fuel is going to be taxed, your tickets have VAT on them, and you start to use more of these synthetic fuels. Right. And in the course of doing that, those synthetic fuels will push up the price of tickets, which will mean that the growth in aviation will be slower than otherwise planned. Right. So for us, these synthetic fuels, which are still made from electricity, are the solution rather than battery electric planes.
Yeah.
Maybe battery electric planes for small local aircraft. Private aircraft, that's probably feasible. But for flying large numbers of people around, don't see that.
No, I don't think it's that. I mean, I was at a conference in Norway last year where someone high up in the Norwegian government was saying that was their aim, was to because they do a lot of short haul flights in between fjords and things in Norway, and they're like 10, 15, 20 seat small passenger planes they use, and they really believe they can electrify that within the next 10 years. But they're flying like 100 or 200 miles. It's not very far. It's not very big. I can imagine that is not impossible. But certainly a transatlantic flight. There was one aerospace engineer I spoke to at the launch of at the first flight across the channel of Airbus Industries. They made a little twin, what do you call it, a ducted fan, had 2 ducted fans. And I did stand behind it when it started up, and it's quite strong. So when it first was going, well, that's just like it's like a Dyson hairdryer. It's not that, that's no good. Then when he'd only just started it, when he went, then I fell over. But he was saying that the economic driving force behind it is electric takeoff and landing, and then they use a jet engine. So what they're trying to develop is, how do you get a plane to 8,000, 10,000 feet without using jets? because that would massive reduction in fuel, because that's a huge amount of fuel to get it there. And then there's no way that the batteries or whatever, we're talking batteries in 10, 15 years time, they would never be able to go across the Atlantic. Well, then you use a jet when it's already up in the air, but a much smaller jet, because you don't need all that power to get you going. Once you're up in the air and moving, it's much easier. And then when it comes into land, he got really excited about this. You turn the jet off and you start to sail down. Well, you're using the ducted fans as air brakes. They're spinning, they're generating electricity. And the idea was you would have this perpetual motion electric flight there and back. That you'd only use a bit of jet fuel in the middle. You wouldn't even need to charge it. It would recharge by the time it landed, which sounded a little bit, well, I think they'd done some actual maths. Because if you're dropping from 35,000 feet, you're going to get a lot of wind, and you're only trying to get up to 10,000. That was the argument. You're not going as high with electricity. But the economic argument behind that was Heathrow could run 24 hours a day. You could have planes taking off at 1 and 2, 3 in the morning. Doesn't matter. No one can hear them, which, would be nice if you live near there.
So maybe what we're going to get to is combination solutions. Batteries to get the plane up there, synthetic fuels to fly them across the Atlantic, and then recharge the batteries as the plane comes into land. Yeah. I mean, that's effectively a form of plug-in hybrid.
It's a plug-in hybrid.
Fuel.
I know. But I mean, is that because this is the other thing that it doesn't feel right, but I bet it is the impact of the amount of international air travel that we all, well, not we all, the very privileged few like me have experienced. It's just when you're like, if you come into land in Los Angeles and you're in a plane and you look down and you can see, 1.25 million cars on the freeways, and you go, I can't believe this one plane is producing more than all those cars, than those tens of thousands, millions of engines. But I don't know what the equivalent impact of passenger flights is in terms of, in comparison with ground transport. Is it less or more?
If you take a flight from, say, Newquay up to Scotland, or Newcastle, compared to driving a conventional diesel car, the emissions from the plane would be higher per passenger.
Per passenger, wow.
Per passenger. They're not massively higher,
right?
But they are higher.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you then start to, I did some calculations recently. If you were to fly to the south of France, for example, you'd be able to drive that back and forth about 20 times.
Wow. Okay, in a diesel car now. I mean, you're not talking electric car. Bloody hell.
No, in a diesel.
That is shocking, isn't it? Yeah.
If you were to go by train, you'd be able to go backwards and forwards for the rest of your life. So there's only so much time you spend on trains.
Yeah, I do love trains though. Yeah.
So they definitely are worse. And for us, as I say, the solution lies in decarbonising the fuel.
Right.
Because potentially I like your ideas of combining it with some electric takeoff and landing.
Yeah.
But the fuel is what's key.
Yeah. And then I suppose the other one, because that's the one I'm desperate to do something about, but it's really difficult to organise or the logistics of it, is shipping. So it might have been 15 years ago, I made a series for, I think for Channel 4 or Channel 5 called How Do They Do It? And one of them was, how do you load and unload a container ship? And so I went to Bristol docks, in fact, the Bristol container depot, and I went up one of those terrifying cranes and we lifted up, do it all. I didn't, because I would have dropped it on someone. But then we went on the ship, which was amazing. This was a truly vast container ship. And a really lovely Malaysian captain who, of course, all the crew were Malaysians and Vietnamese, and they were amazing. Really, it was such a lovely environment. I went, I want to stay. I desperately wanted to stay on it. And we went out into the Bristol Channel, and I had to get off. It was going to Buenos Aires. That's where the ship was heading to, from Bristol. And I had to get off and get on a pilot boat and go back to Bristol in my car and be, and this thing was going off across the Atlantic. But I asked him how many gallons it used to get out of the deck. This was like not on camera. It wasn't part of the show. I was just fascinated by the scale of it. We went in the engine room. It's just mind-boggling. And he said, we don't measure it in gallons. We measure it in tons. About 40 tons of what's that? What do they call the fuel? It's really got an ugly name. It's like sump oil, but it isn't. Anyway, it's very dirty. It's basically what's left over when you've refined crude oil, isn't it? It's the dregs.
It's the bottom of the tank.
The bottom of the tank, and they use 40 tons just to get this thing moving, and you just think that is unbelievable scale. But I mean, it is a huge boat, and the amount of, I don't know how many containers it had on, a lot.
See, for that kind of long haul shipping, people are looking at ammonia in particular.
Yes, I've heard about this. Yeah.
So that's a really interesting solution.
Right.
Again, you make that ammonia using hydrogen and sort of naturally sourced nitrogen. So yeah, the ammonia could be a renewable fuel. Right. But for short sea shipping, don't try saying that too fast.
Yeah.
Actually, batteries again can be really good, and Norway's got some electric ferries that are.
Yeah, we've been on an electric ferry. It's brilliant. Yeah.
And for kind of short trips to Scottish Islands, to the Isle of Man, or to the Isle of Wight, or even across the Channel, electric ferries would work perfectly well. You just charge them at either end.
Yeah. But
you obviously need the port infrastructure to be able to cope with it.
Yeah,
but for long distances, it looks like ammonia is a really promising solution.
And that's
some people say gas, but gas is a fossil fuel. It's not a long-term solution.
But when you say is that ammonia then used in a combustion engine? It's not going through a fuel cell or anything like that. It's still driving a big combustion engine.
Yeah, it's driving a big combustion engine.
But it isn't producing the CO2, or it's recycling it. Is the CO2? Does it become a circular economy of CO2?
Yes.
Is that the idea?
You have to capture. Actually, you can use ammonia in fuel cells as well. So you can use it in a fuel cell.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea is that you've got to capture you've got to produce the hydrogen renewably. If you start producing lots of energy to make the ammonia, that's not going to have any benefits for the planet. So you've got to make that ammonia renewably. And that's, everything at the end of the day comes back to having clean electricity.
Yeah.
Whether you're putting that electricity into a battery, or you're turning it into hydrogen, or you're turning it into ammonia, or into a synthetic fuel, it's all about green electricity. And of course, that's where we're getting such incredible progress at the moment, because the price of renewables, of wind and solar, are coming down so quickly. Yeah. Even yesterday, I got some figures. 2/3 of the energy use in the UK yesterday came from wind and solar.
Wow.
Yesterday, the average grid intensity was 80 grams per kilowatt hour.
Right.
Incredibly low.
Wow.
And that's today.
Yeah. No, that is amazing, isn't it? But it is very obvious that stuff is, that's the problem, I think, is when you have direct personal experience, because I've got batteries and solar here and all kinds of, experimental bits of electronics. But it's when I know how much the solar panels that are on my roof cost, and that's retrofitting them, after the fact. The building was here and we had to get scaffolding. And then I go around and see all these new buildings being done. Well, they've already got scaffolding, or they were about to put the roof on. Don't put tiles on it, put solar panels on it. You knuckle-dragging morons. The people that are behind the building industry in this country are 50 years behind the car industry, probably 10 years behind the fossil fuel industry. They're behind everyone. And they're still producing these dreadful, energy inefficient, executive-style homes. And it's just heartbreaking. I mean, it's just because it can be done. I think that's the frustration, is the technology is there. It doesn't make it more expensive. It's much cheaper to live in. Our electricity bill this month for April will be under £10, and we're charging 2 electric cars. I mean, to be fair, we're not driving anywhere. But we've had the washing machine on like mad.
I'm glad you said that, because I was expecting a knock on the door any time.
So have you been doing leisure driving? No, only to the shops. Very boring. But yeah, I think that's that area. The in a way, that's something that we had planned to cover a lot this year, and hopefully we will still be able to. But what's happening in buildings and in households, there's a huge amount of interest in that in a way surprises me. If you look at the most viewed episodes that we've ever made, stuff about batteries in houses is really close to the top. You think, well, a battery is the most boring thing to film. If you think about it, it's a box. It doesn't do anything. It's very hard to make it interesting, but there's a lot of real interest in that area.
You're dead right. The construction industry, particularly the housing sector, are complete dinosaurs.
Yeah.
We should have been doing this stuff 20 years ago, and we're still throwing up houses today, which are not fit for today, let alone for 100 years' time.
Yeah.
The point you make about batteries, though, is really interesting because, of course, everybody keeps saying about electric cars, what we're going to do about the batteries, we can't. Yeah. But actually, what we're discovering is that we can take those batteries out of cars at the end of their life, and they're perfectly good for storage in houses. It's storage for the electricity grid. So they have a second life there where they can be supporting a renewable electricity grid. And that's exactly where most of them are going to finish up, sort of alongside people's houses with solar panels providing electricity.
Yeah. I think that's one of the really big changes over the last 10 years is 10 years ago when, I'm just going to mention his name because he was very at the forefront of it, but people like Jeremy Clarkson said, after 3 years driving your fancy Nissan Leaf, you'll throw the batteries away. And he said it with such confidence and such, and he's funny and he does it really well. And everyone believed him. And at the time, I kind of suspected he might be wrong, but no one had any proof because we hadn't had those. You'd had those batteries for a long time, but not in the form and the scale that they were in cars, not with the software that protected them for their lives and all that stuff. No one knew because I kept asking people, how long will they last? And everyone's going, we don't really know, and that was sort of people from Nissan, people from Renault, people from Tesla. They didn't know. Now we know that they'll outlast the car by decades, basically, but maybe not in the car, And there's a lot of talk recently, and I now understand what that means of the 1 million mile battery. So the 2,500 recharge cycles means it would run for 1 million miles, in a car. Well, the car will be falling to bits after, the amount of effort you have to make to keep that car going after 500,000 miles is.
They'll be rebuilding the car around the battery. Not replacing the battery.
No, you'll rebuild the car. I think that is far more likely. In the next 10 years, we'll see cars being rebuilt around batteries. We're already seeing it with all these amazing conversions that are being done. They're all second-hand, second life batteries already they're using. And they are perfectly adequate. Just going to check that. I just want to thank you because we've kind of skirted around lots of issues. I'd love to talk to you again. I want you to come back on the show, but because I really did, it's really interesting to get that from you. And I want to have slightly better, more detailed questions, but I think we've covered a lot of interesting areas and good luck to you with all your future, developments and lobbying. Get in there, badger those. I think we can say fairly battered ministers. They all look terrified at the moment.
They're pretty exhausted at the moment. I would say I think this is a really good time. I think the new ministers in the Department for Transport, I think they're really listening. I think they're really progressive. I think there has been a culture change within the department with the new ministerial team, and that's really positive. I think they are genuinely trying to do the right things. But as you say, there's a legacy. It's going to take some time to get it right. But it's been great to chat with you. Thanks for your time, and happy to answer your questions anytime.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Well, I'd like to thank Greg for his time during this difficult period that we're all living through, and that's all we've got time for. I was really fascinated by what he had to say. Do the normal things if you want to. There's very, very zero pressure. It's worth checking out all the information on fullycharged.show. Got all the stuff about the live shows, about the merchandise, about what's going on. There's lots of interesting blogs on there, all kinds of really good stuff on that. That's a good thing to see because there are some really cool live shows coming around the world, and we're planning more in the future. But other than that, then do the subscribe thing. That would be nice if you want to. Have a look at the Patreon thing. That would be nice if you want to. And as always, if you have been, thank you for watching.